right, so it's now preparing to stream live, so that should do its thing here. Okay, so I believe we're now streaming. Slide this over here. So we're recording and we're streaming. And let's see, Jamel, is there any other sort of administrative Zoom meeting updates I should give? You've done a really good job with planning board, so I'm just trying to think through all the things you go through before we kick those meetings off. But I think I've touched base on a lot of them.
I'd say keep rolling with it, and we'll deal with public comment when we get there.
Okay.
How's that sound?
All right. So with that, Dave, I'll turn it to you. And
yeah, I have nothing more to add. I think, yeah, we continue as we have in the past with you leading the discussion in terms of your slide presentation. We can discuss it as our committee as civilly as we possibly can to get to some consensus, and then turn it over to public comment and see who's out there and who wants to chime in on where we're headed with this. As I see, the minutes are really up for just review. There's no vote on those today, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah, I guess you could vote on those if you're so inclined. Typically, that's how we've just listed it, as review of minutes, but I guess it would be more clear if we said approval of minutes. But
okay. Anybody have comments on the minutes?
No.
Nope.
Anyone?
Nope.
I mean, there is a little grammatical cleaning up that could take place, but the intent and the content is all good. Anybody want to make a motion?
Move to approve the minutes from the previous meeting.
Second.
I'll second.
All in favor?
so actually, Dave, one thing I did forget to mention, because I forget we're an advisory board, we don't take many votes, but when there is voting on Zoom, it does need to be done by roll call. So either you can call the roll or I can, whatever you're more comfortable with.
Or we can postpone it till we're all together. I mean, does it matter? Go ahead and, yeah, you have the roll in front of you, so.
All right.
Jay, can't we do a voice, yays and nays? And if
Yes.
anybody votes nay, I mean, as a group, rather than spend time going through a list?
Nope, actually, the state requirement
Okay.
allowing us to do meetings this way says we have to do a roll. Any vote needs to be done by roll call. So I'll run
Okay.
through it pretty quickly. Mr. Paul,
Yay.
Miss Katerina,
Sorry, I was muted. Yay.
Miss Roy,
Yay.
Mr. Fellows,
Yay.
Mr. Shanae,
Yes.
Mr. Merrill,
Yes.
Miss Saunders.
Yes.
Okay.
It's real official.
Okay.
I like that.
We've succeeded in getting through our first item today. So, next item is growth management. So Jay has a presentation. We'll let you run with this, Jay.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So just bear with me a moment while I do this. Slide everything around. Whoops, let's see. Oh, how did I lose that? All right, so hopefully you're now seeing my screen. Are you seeing my screen at this point?
Yes.
Yes.
sir.
Excellent. So yeah, let's see. Let's maybe before I jump into the presentation, just I think as we've talked about, and folks know, this is an issue that's come before the board through the Ordinance Committee. Not sure if anyone was able to attend or watch the Ordinance Committee meeting from yesterday afternoon, but this is the same presentation that I ran through at that point. And so there's been, interest on the council to do a review of our growth management ordinance, which is something that the ordinance requires that we take a look at every 3 years. And so this is part of that process. Jean Marie, I don't know if you want to provide any other context before I jump into the presentation at this point.
Yeah, part of the driving force, so obviously we need to review this per the ordinance every 3 years. But there's some, there are some people in town who think that we're overly aggressive with development, and they have some concerns, and they brought it forward to some of the counselors. So that's part of the driving force behind this also. So just keep that in mind. And Jay sent you a letter yesterday that came from the ordinance committee that we can talk about afterwards, but just to help you focus, I will tell you, I personally am not asking you to act on all of this like overnight. It is a process because we want to make sure it's done correctly. So with that, I'll let Jay do. This is it's a very good presentation in my mind. And I know it was helpful with some of the counselors last night too. So there you go. Thanks, Jay.
Okay, so with that, I'll launch into the presentation, then we'll circle back to the letter and sort of thoughts moving forward. So just quickly, these are the items I'm going to run through, just sort of a little bit of background in the first 2 items, really talking about how growth is, what's happening in the region and how Scarborough fits with that. Quick overview of the growth management ordinance. I know many of you are familiar with it. Couple of the items that there's been, that we were hearing a lot of questions from, or I was hearing a lot of questions from counselors about, was particularly around the reserve pool and fractional units. So I spend a few slides talking about those and giving an update where we're at with those items. And then sort of finish up by just talking about what we've seen in, for development in the community in the last few years, and then the permitting history over the last 10 to 12 years. And then I have a final slide that really just starts to maybe help to identify some questions or analysis that we might want to consider moving forward. And we can certainly build off that or do what we will with that. So just real quickly, and again, I know this committee is very familiar with all these items, having worked through these issues over the years, the comprehensive plan update that we're working on. But as I think everyone knows, Scarborough has been a rapidly growing community for many decades. And in particular, over the last decade or so, this helps sort of put the issue in sort of the regional context that while Scarborough continues to grow at a pretty good clip of 7, almost 8%, there's other communities within the region that are sort of feeling the same pressures, and we're all dealing with the impacts as best we can. Just an update with regards to sort of the aging of our community. You can sort of see here, the first 2 bars are showing that our younger demographics under 18 are reducing by percentage of population, and those that are 65 and older are increasing by percentage of population. So like the state, our town is aging. So, frankly, I think a number of you probably know more of the history than I do, who guys, a couple of your names are on the growth and services report, and we're involved in that process. But, essentially the growth management ordinance really came out of the late 90s, early 2000s. There was significant growth happening in the town. You can see here over a 6-year period, there's about 1,100 new single family homes that were built. 1,200 total units. So there was rapid growth, and that was really starting to put pressures on the municipal services. My understanding was it more acutely was the schools, but also other departments in terms of public safety demands, public work demands, other municipal services, just trying to provide what the residents desired. So that really led to the growth and services report, which is sort of what the growth management ordinance was one of the outgrowths of. So what the growth management ordinance seeks to do is really pace the rate of housing construction, of residential development. And I'll just sort of make mention that, state statute requires that it allows towns to have a growth management ordinance, but that you have to allow for a certain amount of permits in a given year. And that amount is set at 105% of a 10-year average of permits. So, towns can't just, that's a minimum, I should say. You can do more than that. You don't have to have a growth management ordinance, but as a minimum, it has to be 105% of the number of permits issued in the last 10 years. Provides for immediate housing and ensure fairness in the allocation of building permits, and continue to plan for residential growth. So how does it do those things? We establish an annual allocation of 135 growth permits. So those are available at the first of every year. January 1, there's 135 growth permits that become available, and they're available on a first come, first served basis. Of those 135, no more than 20% of that 135, so that's 27 units, can be allocated to any one subdivision. And this is an item we'll talk about maybe a little bit later, because it was a question that was raised at the ordinance committee. So the growth management ordinance also seeks to direct housing to our growth areas. We do that by only allowing a maximum of 50%, I said that last night as well, 50 units or growth permits in our limited growth areas. So all the others are then directed to the growth areas. And then as the ordinance includes what we call our reserve pool. This is a pool of permits that are set aside for special projects that are using density incentives like our affordable housing or development transfer, affordable housing projects, or projects that come through the contract zone process that council deems merit. All right, so yeah, I'm gonna start. So just a little background or update on our reserve pool. Prior to 2008, which is really the last time there was a substantive changes made to the growth management ordinance, any unused growth permits that were part of that annual allocation were carried forward year to year until they were issued. So we really weren't creating a reserve pool per se. We were just adding to that annual allocation for any that rolled over. In 2008, the amendment basically created a fixed reserve pool, which eliminated the year-to-year carryover and assigned the filling of the pool, if you will, or the number of units in the pool as a function of town council. So town council, and actually I'll talk about this at my next slide, so I'll just hold off on that thought for a moment. It was also sort of is identified in the 2008 amendments that this 20% of annual allocation to any one development could have would restrict the size of multifamily developments, or could have the impact of restricting multifamily developments that are otherwise permitted in the town's growth areas. And so this led to both sort of the establishment of the reserve pool, as I talked about, and the allowance for certain projects to pull from that, but also the sort of fractional growth permits that relates to our fractional density calculations in the zoning ordinance. I'll talk to that in just a moment. So let's see. I think many of the members on the committee currently were probably on the committee back in 2017 when there was some discussion and at the long range level that wound up obviously going to council about looking at increasing the reserve pool in 2017 from 215 units at the time to 500 units. Some of the rationale based on the materials of the time were that there was a identified market demand for multifamily. It's really sort of seen as a potential blip in demand. There was really low vacancy rates within the greater Portland area. It was really identified not only in Scarborough, but really a regional issue in terms of housing choice and demand. Part of the consideration that went into effect is, as I mentioned before, had the growth permits been able just continued to roll over as they had done before 2008, there would have actually been over 700 additional permits available, which would have been enough to address the expected demand at the time of the discussion. And further sort of research indicated that 1 and 2 bedroom units typically have less demand for services while having increased tax valuations. So this is just a slide here, just to give people an update of where we're at with our reserve pool. Again, as I said, we had 500 as of, I think it was January or February of 2017. There were 500 permits in the reserve pool. To date, 319 and a half of those are either used or accounted for. And when I say accounted for, I'm considering Piper Shores, which the town council, as part of the contract zone for their phase 2 or expansion process, reserved 52 of the reserve pool permits for that project. So, and of those 319 and a half permits that are used or accounted for, that totals 493 units to be created. And that gets to this fractional calculation that I'm going to talk about now. So again, talking about the 2008 amendments, this was really sort of springboarding off amendments that were conducted or completed with the zoning ordinance in 2007, sort of following the work of the comprehensive plan to really look at modifying or adjusting how much density certain units equate. So a 1 bedroom unit that's also less than 750 square feet is considered to be a half a unit for density purposes and for growth permit purposes. A 2 bedroom unit that's also less than 1,200 square feet counts as 2/3 of a unit. A 3 bedroom or anything over 1,200 square feet counts as a whole unit. And these factors really only apply to multifamilies. These don't apply to single family homes. Let's see. And so, some of the factors that went into the consideration, particularly as provided as part of the growth management discussion, was really looking at what are the demands of services of those smaller units. And so, as you can see here, and we can dive into these type of numbers going forward, but back in 2008, you can see the different unit types and the different demands on sewage load, number of occupants per unit, in average vehicle trips. And sort of taking all those, it was that was how we determined sort of the fractional density calculations and growth permit calculations. Let's see. So, okay, now transition just a little bit into, so what's been happening in the marketplace that's been different over the last few years? And really it was the demand for multifamily. Single family has continued to be steady. I think those numbers have been fairly steady, up and down a little bit, but sort of always within the same sort of margins. But obviously multifamily, we've seen quite a jump. Really starting back in 2015 is when we started to see things take off a little bit, but it wasn't until 2017 and 2018 where we saw quite a bit of demand. A lot of that demand is from the Beacon project at the corner of Higas and Payne Road. That was part of a contract zone process. This is where we start to see the downs come online. In the Crossroads Development District, that's where we permit upwards of 20 units per acre. And while, you know, there's certainly been some residential growth, the densities that have been sought have not really approached that number, but certainly there's been a good bit of residential development occurring there. And so you can also see how many units, not only units have been created, but what it meant in terms of growth permits. And this is a mixture of reserve pool and annual allocation permits. So demand's still there. This is just some pipeline projects. As you can see, there's still some multifamily that's coming down the pike. Again, I'm referencing Piper Shores here because it hasn't got started. But there's been, you know, some newer projects both within the Downs and other areas of town that are continue to show interest. And as I said, single family developments continues to be fairly steady. So these are the type of things we can expect in the next year or so. So this slide, it's really my last slide, informational slide before I get to sort of my wrap up. This is showing you growth permit, not only the number of growth permits, but also the number of units that have been issued over the last, 10, 12 years here. So what you're seeing is that the dotted blue line that's steady on the horizon there, that's the 135 annual allocation. So you can see, you know, really we weren't approaching that much until we get to the year 2015. The orange or brown, whatever color it's showing up on your screen, are the number of growth permits that have been issued in a given year. The yellow is the actual number of growth permits plus permits for Hillcrest state manufactured homes. That development does not pull growth permits. So that's the actual number of of whole unit permits that the town has issued. The gray are the total number of units. So again, where I talk about the yellow being whole unit permits, if you remember, permits can be issued in fractions. So it's yellow is the whole units permits. Gray is the actual number of units. So those could be those are then the 1 and 2 bedroom in addition to the full units. And so again, you can see the spike that I talked about starting in 2015, but really taking off in 17 and 18. And to date, you know, we're the 2020 numbers, I believe, are through, I think Robin pulled those for me, I think through June 15. I was able to update this earlier in the week. So we're about halfway through the year with that. Oh, here's this is just an example. So this presentation is really, you know, I put a little bit of a shine on the presentation that was given to Town Council and the Board of Education some months ago. And at that time, there was one of the questions really came around, excuse me, there was concerns or questions around, there's a large incoming kindergarten class. And some questions were being asked as to where those students were coming from. So we did an analysis working with our colleagues up in the school department, really looking at so where were these kindergartners coming from, and we found that actually there were none of the incoming kindergartners were coming from the multifamily developments as of 2017. I should mention this was for last year's incoming class. This is data from the summer of 2019. Only 4% were coming from pre-existing multifamily developments. And really what we found is so that means 96% were coming from single family homes. And of those, 92% were coming from housing stock that is at least 5 years or older. starts to give an indication that maybe the pressures the school are feeling aren't so much from the new developments, but it's from turnover of our older housing stock, the single families that were built through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s and such. We have started a conversation with the school. Actually, I'm in communication with the school right now to try to update these numbers for their entire enrollment for the coming year. So we're going to see if we can work on that to really get a good understanding of what those type of impacts are as we go through this conversation. So my final slide, this is really, based on some of the communication I had seen from town council, some other thoughts by staff as to what are the type of things and questions that we might have as we progress with this conversation. I think one of the things I heard coming out of Ordinance Committee is they're really, and Jean Marie, certainly correct me if I go astray here, is really seeking long-range planning committee's help in terms of sort of framing the problem, or maybe that's not quite the right way of saying it, but framing the issues, understanding, what is it that we should really be exploring and analyzing. And so these are just some thoughts to start the conversation. And let's see, what else do I have? I guess that's going to be it for the presentation. So,
Jay, do you want me to go over that letter real quickly, what the ordinance committee's looking for? Like read it. I've got it right
Yep.
here if you want me to. I don't know if you have it to put up, but
I can certainly pull it up. I'll look to the committee if that's what we want to jump to. I'm happy to pull that up as well. All right. Not hearing anything, I'm going to
Might as
assume.
well review it.
yeah,
I'm going to share. You're not seeing it right now, are you?
no,
All right, hang on, bear with me.
there you go.
You have it now? Excellent.
Yeah, and basically we met last night. Our next meeting regarding growth management will be August 20th. So there's 2 months here. And, I absolutely understand that because I'm one of these people that I do take vacation time in the summer. So, we got to factor all of that in too. But here we go. What we're looking for is some advice. And we've had everything coming from the council from a moratorium on growth to measures including elimination of the building permit pool, revision of practice of fractionalization, as well as managing the issuance of permit approvals. And this is by developer versus by development. And I believe Councilor Johnson, that was one that he talked about last night. So what we're looking for, what are the top 3 strategic long-range issues that you think need to be addressed? And then I'm going to go back because we definitely got to get this comp plan done and out there because everything derives from that comp plan, to be honest with you. Because when you look at the Title 30A, the state statutes related to this, it all goes back to our comp plans. Top 3 positive and negative impacts of growth and development. I know one of the major issues that comes up frequently is traffic. The perception that the traffic increases in town are caused by our development. And I'll leave that at that because I don't necessarily believe it's all from our development. Let's see, specific immediate midterm measures we should consider to enhance the benefits of growth, because let's face it, you can't stop growth, but you can manage it. And the specific immediate midterm measures and other inputs that you think we should consider. So we're just looking for some direction from long-range planning because you folks have a wealth of experience with this and have more of a history than some of the counselors do. So any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
So Jay, I my firm has clients whose interests would be potentially affected by changes to this ordinance. So I'm going to have to abstain from providing any comments or inputs. I don't think there's any problem with me participating since it's or listening since it's a public hearing, but I can't express any positions one way or another on the ordinance in light of my client's potential interest being affected.
Everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
So I don't know if folks want me to continue sharing, or I can turn that off and come back to it once if there's questions that come up.
Jay, one question on the growth permits. Do they expire after any period of time, or do they get extended, or how do those?
Yep, so the annual allocation permits, for the most part, what happens is people will, when they come in for their building permit, that's also the same time that they get their growth permit. And so things are synced up nicely, and it happens pretty simultaneously. However, it is possible and permissible to purchase a growth permit ahead of getting a building permit. And essentially what it says is that growth permit is good for 6 months. And then if it's not activated, if construction hasn't started, it expires. That has not happened. I'll have to check with Robin. If it's happened once in the last 10 years, I'll be a little bit surprised. So it's very infrequent. I will say my understanding, again, now this is, I wasn't here at the time. My understanding is when the original growth permit went into place, sort of that first year, there was sort of a quick rush. A lot of people bought growth permits and then realized that, they expired, and that the town for a number of years, as was shown on the one slide, we weren't hitting the growth, that growth max at 135. So that rush, that concern sort of went away pretty quickly, as I understand it. And I will say in the last couple years, obviously we've exceeded the 135. A lot of those have come straight out of the reserve pool. These are projects that were already eligible for the reserve pool. I think there was a couple, I think in those years we did hit the number, but we sort of hit the number right in December, right at the end of the year. So hopefully that helps answer some of the question.
Yeah. And explain to me clarify the Hillcrest, how were they grandfathered? Or?
Yeah, so that was a question that came from Councilor Ken Johnson. After I gave this original presentation, he asked, about Hillcrest, and I assumed they were pulling growth permits. And when I asked sort of the Robin Dahms, who the woman who tracks these, she said, no, Hillcrest actually doesn't pull growth permits. And our understanding of why is that prior to the 2008 amendments, there was a provision that said senior housing developments didn't need to pull growth permits. So they were exempt from growth permits. And so that continued forward. And of that project of Hillcrest that had some 190, 170, I can't remember how many new units that were to be developed, there's only about 11 or 12 left to be developed at this point. So by and large, that project has largely been built out.
Anybody have other questions or clarifications that need?
Yeah, I had raised my hand. Is it okay if I go next?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'm wondering if the responses are going to be on an individual basis, or we need to answer these questions as a group, is my first question, and I have two other questions.
I guess, so do you mean the responses to the email or yeah, I guess I would think it would be as a committee, we work through the issues and come up with a committee response would be my
Okay, and then my second question is relating to that would be, are other boards or committees also going to be answering this, like the Conservation Commission, the Planning Board, Energy and Sustainability? Are others going to be answering this too?
So the one thing I'll say, and then I'll defer to Jean Marie, is this committee's charge is to look at issues of growth. So that's sort of the clear nexus, if you will. And at this point, the Ordinance Committee has really asked this committee to work on the issues. I haven't heard the request to other committees to date.
I would say that no, they're looking at for long-range planning since actually under the charter, you are the advisory committee for anything to do with growth in the town. Now, there may be some, in the way I'm looking at rules and charter and whatever, there may be some reason for the planning board to weigh in, but I would rather start with long-range planning, given the background of this committee.
I would just add too, or point out that, as was mentioned earlier by Jean Marie, there is a tie-in here to the comp plan, and certainly as part of the comp plan process, those other groups weighed in, not necessarily on these questions the way that they're worded here, but there definitely are some of those themes and issues that are sort of baked into that.
Thank you, Corey. That's exactly what I was getting at, because I was wondering what exactly will be done with the information once it's collected, and how will it be applied moving forward?
Oops, sorry, I was on mute. Basically, what happens is the town council has the ultimate authority to make any changes to the growth ordinance, growth management ordinance. So this is just the beginning of it. That's all I can say at this point. That's all I know.
I will say one of the other things that came up at the Ordinance Committee meeting last night was, and I think it's actually even in that email, and I think Tom Hall really brought it up pretty succinctly, was around, ensuring that we engage sort of all, not only the residents and the public in general, but I think the development community as well, because obviously they have a vested interest that should be heard. And I think one of the things I heard from Ordinance Committee was, asking long-range planning, how, what's a good way to sort of involve all parties, all stakeholders. I think that's one of the things that this committee is pretty well known for over the last decade or more of your work, that, you start to identify issues and then really start that public engagement before you really identify answers. You sort of try to put the issues before folks, get everyone's thoughts and inputs, and then start to coalesce around some potential recommendations to council and vet those yet again before those even get to council. So what that process looks like, I think, is part of this early discussion. And I think understanding that the Ordinance Committee wants to take, is going to be very actively involved as well. And ultimately, obviously, the entire council is going to be very actively involved.
And my final question is, how does this relate to any directive or coordination with SEDCO and SEDCO's board?
I think Karen's here, if I remember right. I'm going to stop sharing because I can't quite see everybody. I'm happy to come back to sharing, but.
Hi. I don't think there's a direct relationship other than that I obviously participate as staff for this committee, for Long Range Planning Committee. And to the extent that this does really focus on the residential permitting, we probably have less of a direct nexus to that. However, certainly there is a relationship between housing and economic development. And to that, my board would be, happy to weigh in should there be questions or input or requests for information.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question, Jay?
Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm new to the committee, so I appreciate the folks sort of bringing me up to speed, but I'm just wondering if, and I'm not as familiar with the growth management ordinance and the work that's been done in, long range, but can you tell me the difference or if growth management permits apply to commercial development?
They do not. This
Okay,
is-
so it's just managing the general population
it's
and their public
residential.
service needs. Okay, thank you.
Yep, and that's out of state statute. That it's really about, so.
Well, I kind of see three issues that we're trying to tackle here, if you don't mind me just chiming in. One is the growth ordinance, the pressures on the growth ordinance, does it need to change? Two, the questions that are here in front of us, and those kind of lead to the growth ordinance. And then third, marrying in the comprehensive plan. So it seems like we've got a good chunk of work to get our arms around and understand here as we try to move forward. Anybody have thoughts that we haven't heard of yet that want to chime in? Judy?
Yeah, I'm foreign to what's been going on. Things seem to move so fast, but I think the conclusion of the ordinance committee or the middle response that Jay provided to us, what I saw was now some more identified effect questions or comments about, there's always traffic and there's always congestion. Taxes are always a problem and schools are always a problem. But the presentation also said the preservation of neighborhood and the character of our community. And those are two additions that have not been typically in any reports that we've done, unless I missed it.
If I could jump in, I'm sorry, I'm getting an echo maybe because I'm jumping in. I do know that I believe it was Councillor Gleistein had mentioned last night that she was concerned about the effect of development on natural resources. And what was the other one, Jay? I'm sorry, I don't have my notes right in front of me.
Let me see. And I know, I believe Councillor Gleistein is still on the meeting. Let me see what I can find. Let's see, impacts of public safety and access on.
That's right.
Of access, natural resources.
Yeah.
And I think there's been a lot of that as far as the effect on the natural resources. And I don't know if it includes animals, but I live over in Green Acres and we've certainly had development. And lots of little animals have migrated my way. And, there's just been a lot of change in the community as it presents itself. So those are things that maybe sometimes are not identified and researched a little bit to lend credence to, the development.
Alan?
Yeah, one of the things I guess that I would want to talk about here is I feel like the town of Scarborough is somewhat unique that it actually has two different populations. It has I'll call it the winter or the school year population. And then it also has the added influx of the summer tourists that come into town. Now, I've seen two things. Obviously, the amount of traffic during the summertime is substantially more. And I think it's the traffic that most people are concerned about in terms of what's happening to our community. I would want us to be considering, as we think about how our ordinance may be impacted, that we consider what happens to us more 9 months out of the year during school, when school is in session, because that really is, if we want to concern ourselves about what's happening with the schools and how much do we have to add, restrictions to growth based on the fact that we think schools are getting out of control, we should consider that, because we see a huge influx in the summertime that really does not impact schools whatsoever. So I guess I just want us to think about that maybe in two different ways.
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess one of the things that I had thought and had put as sort of a possible areas for consideration is really, you know, one of the slides I talked about sort of those type of analysis that were done, you know, 10, 12, 13 years ago, 07, 08 timeframe when the community was going through the process of looking at the fractional units and for density purposes. There was some analysis based on the literature of the time and really sort of taking a look at, you know, let's dust off those documents and look at what the more recent literature is saying for that. But also, what can we do to try to do some local analysis, whether that's just Scarborough specific or within the region, if there's other communities that might have some information they could share. So we can sort of see if the information that led to the original decision still bears out, and that, you know, would inform what we might want to do or have things changed. So that was sort of part of an initial analysis piece that I thought might be helpful. Part of the conversation.
A little more data here and there. I mean, just doing a quick math in the 10-year average and what you see in the pipeline, there's 500 due in the next couple of years, which is above, you know, a little above our 135 plus some reserve pools. So, you know, we may not be far off, but it would be good to get more accurate, more up-to-date averages and data to see if the, you know, what the problem really is, and if it, you know, how it exists, what exists as a problem. Robin?
You're muted, Robin.
Thank you. Yeah, if we're going to consider, you know, additional literature, which I think is very wise, I think it's important to understand the documented impacts. There's been a study by Charlie Colgan of the rural migration in Maine away from, as we know, you know, the rural counties and toward York and Cumberland County. And I'd like us to think about that, but then also within the last 6 months, what we're learning from what's happening in COVID. Just my neighbors next door, I can see their house right now, sold their house throughout COVID. They had 13 offers within 2 days from as far away as Los Angeles and New York. And these are real pressures that Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine are dealing with. So in addition to the trends, I'd like us to the historic trends, I'd like us to start thinking about what's happening in real time in these extraordinary times.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna, I'm sorry,
ahead,
I'm
Jean.
gonna pop in on being a real estate broker. I can confirm it's crazy out there. The minute I put something on the market, I've got 12 offers. And yes, a number of them are from out of state, and they're people who haven't even looked at the place. Because with COVID rules, we're putting out virtual tours. We want people to do, you know, they aren't coming into the house. And there's a lot of cash out there right now. So just keep that in mind. Again, this is anecdotal in my experience. I don't have the data, but it's also what I'm hearing from my from fellow brokers. So just so thanks for bringing that up, Robin.
Corey, you want to?
Yeah, just kind of going back to the theme of data, I do think it's really important that that this conversation be within the framework of as much fact-based information as possible, whether it's sort of, you know, we have data, some of which is referenced in the comp plan, the draft comp plan, about traffic comes from, how much of it is originating outside of Scarborough and in some cases passing through Scarborough. Also data, hard data on school enrollment. What are the real trends? What are so much of it is anecdotal, which is fine as far as it goes. But I think when it comes to things like schools and traffic, it often, and we've talked about this a little bit as a committee, those things often sometimes become proxies for just general resistance to change, which is which is totally understandable, and it's not to be discounted, but I think that as a committee, I think an important role that we should play is to really base things on hard data as much as possible. And going back to the schools, there have been discussions about, what is the net impact on the town tax cost and tax wise. Again, I think sometimes schools in particular become sort of a proxy or a punching bag, depending on how you want to put it. And I just want to make sure that we're rooting things as much as possible in facts. And I know that projecting enrollment trends is notoriously difficult, but I would hate to see the conversation sort of go along a path that just sort of takes as a given that school growth is out of control and that we therefore need to deal with it, just as people often talk about with traffic. So just wanted to put that out there.
I think one of the telling pieces in your presentation, Jay, and I appreciate it, it's very well done. I like the graphics, is the single family turnover. And again, anecdotally, my neighborhood, which has 50 or 60 houses, there's a half dozen new strollers and a lot more kids on bikes in a 20-year-old development that's now turning over again. So I think that may be that it seems to be, and even from your data, is one of the problems that may need to be addressed, and I'm not sure how we address that.
I think that was one of the, as I said, sort of when I did this initial presentation to council and Board of Education, that was one of the elements that staff was hearing, both school staff and town staff, was sort of seeing, because clearly there's been a lot of multifamily being developed, and now we have this big kindergarten class. Well, were they relational? And so that was why that piece of data really started and focused only in on that kindergarten class. But as I said, currently actually have email chain going with school staff to try to get together next week and see if we can expand that to all their school enrollment and really try to do the same type of analysis. So I think that will be very helpful in the conversation in some ways, so we can understand what those impacts are. That's part of that, what I'd sort of see as, we can do the literature review, see what sort of the national trends are, regional trends best we can, but that's real local numbers. So what does it mean for our marketplace, at least in the data we have?
Robin?
So if we're talking about data and potential data gaps, I'd like to bring up a point that probably echoes some of what you may have heard from Councillor Gleistein, which is the effects on natural resource. And I think an easy data trend that we can look at from that is the dissolution or the development of wetlands over the years. I'd like to propose that data be offered up as a potential proxy for the effects on the natural resources. That information would be available either through DEP or Army Corps. And the reason that I offered that up as a proxy is because there is data, but number two, from my experience on the planning board, I think that this is not a local issue. It is not a Scarborough issue. It is a federal and state problem where we are undervaluing the free ecosystem services that wetlands and forested wetlands and forests and riparian corridors provide to the town as a public interest. So as those of you who might follow the planning board, I say all the time when it comes to a contract zone or whatever, these free ecosystem services that wetlands provide are basically flood control, nutrient management. I could go on, as most of you know, but I won't. I'll leave it there. I just want to offer up the destruction of wetlands over time. If we had that data for the town, I think it would tell a very interesting story.
And I'm sure Ms. Gleistein may also mention this, but I think one of the other things I heard was in terms of not only sort of degradation of the resources or transformation of resources, but also access. I think I've heard access to beaches, access to trails. What does it mean as we add population, and how do we ensure our residents have the ability to enjoy what we have? Yeah, so I think that's a hard, that's one that I think that's a hard piece of analysis to try to get your hands around, but certainly any thoughts around that would also probably be helpful.
Yeah, how does that tie to growth management, I guess, is the question.
I feel like wetlands, though the transformation of wetlands to development, I mean, humans need habitat too. So I feel like the destruction of wetlands could definitely have a direct relation to growth management, whereas access to beaches, you may have to extrapolate that. So if you want hard data, I'd rather think about wetland access. And as Susan Oglis said, you know, who was on the board for a long time, all the uplands have been developed. So there are very few properties out there now that don't have wetlands on them that people are looking to develop. So I'll just stop there.
So for us to move forward, I guess, as a group here, I am hearing a few things. We need to gather some data. And in terms of answering the questions here, I don't know if we want to try to tackle some broad answers to these, or I think we all need to do a little homework in terms of what we feel are the impacts and relations to the comprehensive plan. So I'm not sure we're really prepared to answer, but do anybody have thoughts out there on how we move forward in an expeditious manner to get responses out and us move ahead with our goal to get the comprehensive plan out there?
But the one thing I will make mention of is the next ordinance committee, I believe, is late August. I'm going to say around the 18th, 19th, 20th, something.
20th, it's the 20th.
Thank you. So certainly there's time for, of course, you just received the questions last night. I don't think anyone's expecting there to be answers necessarily this morning, but really start to frame. I think so far staff has heard that there's, the sort of areas for data collection that we've laid out seem like we should start working on that. There's general agreement around that. I heard a few items that might be added to that analysis and some outreach we can do to the state to see if we can pull some additional information together. So that's certainly something within the next few weeks, month, that staff can try to pull together to help inform or provide information so you can have a more informed discussion around the issues and a little more time to think about those questions that have been prepared. And then, I think the question around the comp plan, I know this is something for those that were on our last meeting a couple of weeks ago. I think it might have just been Rick and Alan who are able to be there. Jean Marie, maybe you were there, perhaps it was Dawn. There was a few counselors on the call as well, and there was some discussion, maybe it was Corey who was there, around sort of, well, it's summertime. Is that a good time to bring it forward or not? And that's one of these discussions I feel like we have almost every year. There are those in the community who feel like absolutely the summertime is the right time to push things forward. And then there are others who sort of say, well, no, summertime, I don't want to engage. So I don't know that there's ever a single right answer to that question. So I just sort of offer that as that was part of what we talked a little bit about previously, but certainly that, between growth management ordinance and comp plan all at once, that's a whole lot to take in. So how we divvy that up and think about that is not easy.
Being invaded.
And I suggest that maybe we each formulate some of our own answers for this in an email chain, or is that, and how does everybody feel about just trying to put together our, as a group, individually, but as a group, some responses and just some broad ideas about how we feel these questions tie together with the comp plan.
And I think staff would be happy to sort of be the clearinghouse for that, certainly email, but we can sort of say, okay, generally we're hearing this with an outlier of that. Generally we're hearing this with an outlier of that. And then as we come back together again in the next few weeks, maybe that's when we can sort of say, go through it and say, yep, that's right. Or, oh, wait, that outlier, maybe that's the way we should go here, or whatever the case may be. So that way it is, to Robin's, I think, initial question way back in the beginning, that the response be a committee response.
Mhm.
Dave, could I also ask if the committee members would, as they're thinking through this, if there are specific pieces of information that you think you would like, that would be great for Jay and I to know, Jay and Jamel and I to know, so that we can, really begin working on some of the information that can really help you guys make decisions. I mean, I think we have some ideas, some of the types of things that need to be developed, but certainly anything that you think of, that would be great to know.
I'm also happy to report that we do have an intern this summer who will be able to provide some of that analysis or grab some of the data for us. So that's going to be huge for us.
In-house or remotely?
So I believe I guess I'd have to, Larissa Crockett is sort of the coordinator there, but working, I think he's working mostly remotely. I think a lot of the data we'll have him do will be sort of, I think, my initial thinking is I'm going to ask that person to do sort of a lot of that literature review, sort of see what the national trends are, where we can focus more on the local stuff. But we'll see how that breaks out.
Jay, we've got, and Dave, the two counselors are chomping at the bit to
Okay. Do
make
we
some
have
comments.
any more committee discussion on the growth management ordinance aspects of what we think we need to do and moving forward?
I just want to thank Jay for providing a really good presentation for me as a newcomer to this long range planning committee. I really appreciate it. You did a good job of helping get me up to speed. So thank you. And thank you to all your
Agreed.
work over the years.
Yes. So Dave, I see
Okay, we'll wrap up.
if you're ready, I can elevate basically in the order I have. Betsy, Ken, and then are both on right now, and Rocky Risber is also on. I haven't seen him raise his hand yet, but if you'd like, if you're ready for
I
public
guess,
comment.
Probably can take public comment and go one by one.
Okay, I see Ken's hands up. So Ken, I'm going to bring you in here. Just takes a minute for once I hit that for the person to pop up. There he is. And you're currently muted, Ken. There he is.
Thanks. Nobody's chomping at the bit here, Jean Marie. Actually, hey, really appreciate your time and your expertise. So I just want to clarify that the questions that have come forward out of the ordinance committee, there's a time frame on that, sometime in August. So I understand listening to your committee, there's some very good questions, but there isn't time to go out and do any reach out to deep dive studies. We'd like to have something from you by August, if you could.
I'm gonna dispute that to some degree. With all due respect, Mr. Johnson, as much as you can get by August would be good. I'd rather, and I've talked to Councilor Hamel about this, is we'd rather get the correct information
Correct.
than rushed information. I think you would agree with that, Ken.
Absolutely.
So as much as we can get, and definitely data driven is absolutely.
That's right. Absolutely.
Okay. All right, thanks.
We don't want anything rushed.
Yeah,
We're actually looking for the committee for their experience. This is what you guys do, right? You do long range planning. A lot of you have been on the committee for a while, so we want to hear from you, from your experience and what you've seen in the town for the feedback on the questions, but nothing rushed. or would like something in August?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That would be our goal as a recommendation. Yep.
Yeah. That's all I had.
Okay,
I like to let the committees do their work.
great. I'm gonna put you back in the attendee list here if I can figure out. Well, I might just put you on mute. I don't want to drop you from the meeting altogether. So I'm just gonna mute you and then I'll bring Betsy in. She has her hand up. Let's see. Betsy, hold on a moment. I'm gonna bring you over. You're currently muted, Betsy.
Ah, okay, I got
There
it.
you go.
Great. Don't normally use Zoom on my phone, so yeah, so great discussion, much appreciated. And obviously I'm a data person too, so there's a lot of data to look at. I do think I sent a chat. I don't know if everyone sees it. In terms of access, I thought Robin made really good points about the degradation of wetlands. I think that is a good thing to look at. In terms of access to natural resources, I think we can just, kind of look at number of parking spots we have. As we've added a couple of venues and compared to population. I mean, that's a real, that's a real number of access. People have to be able to get there and be on there. We might play with it some, eliminate the waterfront people or something, although there's a lot more access to natural resources than just the beaches and the waterfront. So it's not going to be the be all end all, but it will also be important to understand how many acres of natural resources we have that people have access to. And so, I think when you look at a large city, they very carefully plan parks and things like that, as we have. And it's because the more people you have, the more crowded those things get. And I would just say, I think, I know Judy was a long time elected official. And I apologize, I don't know if others, I can't recall off the top of my head, are elected officials, but have been elected officials in the past. But, when you do decide to run, you do talk to a lot of people. And to me, it's the best thing about running is talking to people and hearing from the folks and hearing from my fellow residents before, during, the campaign, and now of course as an elected official. And growth is a really huge issue. And I heard, in terms of, it's a concern, I heard, people, one person say, I believe it was Corey, people don't like change. And, I agree with that, but I don't know that we can write everything off to people not liking change. And I think when you do go to change a community, in the ways that we've decided, especially over the last few years, to change Scarborough, I think you have to ask why, and should we be doing those changes? Do the changes make sense? And the one place I feel like the data is a little bit difficult to think about is the character of the town and the town as a community. Sometimes the data isn't always going to reflect what's changing about our town that we don't want to change based on the growth, the residential growth. So yes, there's a lot of data we should look at. I think there are intangible factors. I happen to be a believer that you can actually quantify some subjective data to make it easier to analyze. So even with subjective data, I'm often in favor of trying to quantify that in some way. And I'm not offering a way today, but I do really believe that data is important, but we also have to understand, what people are thinking in terms of how our community is changing and what the character is of our community and what we want to be. But great work. Thanks a lot for your time.
Head, Robin.
I'm not always sure how the public sort of comments chime in, but I guess I just wanted to offer up to Councillor Gleistein's comments that I think what we're potentially grappling with here are the decisions that were made more than 20 years ago. I'm thinking of some of these larger developments that just keep adding on and bringing more folks in. And maybe I missed it in the presentation, but the growth permits aren't always used in the years that they're purchased, kind of a thing. And I just feel like let's take no, I don't want to narrow down any particular village or landing or crossing or anything like that. But I just, for the record, I just want to say, I think the increase that we're seeing in populations were decisions that were made long ago, and now we're dealing with the unintended consequences. So, and I think we're all doing a good job to move that forward. So, thank you.
Well, Jay, any summary here that we want to?
Well, I think as we talked just a few moments ago about, I think Karen and I, Jamel, will start working on some of these questions that were talked about both in the last slide that I had areas of possible consideration, as well as some of the things we heard today. We can start to try to generate some data and think about that. I think you laid out a good idea, Dave, about committee members sort of taking time to think about the email we received from the ordinance committee, and sort of sending that around. And again, as I said, staff will be happy to sort of be the clearinghouse for that, and at our next meeting sort of bring forward what we're hearing as if there's a consensus or what we're hearing. I'll just leave it at that. And then as a committee, we can talk about what those responses look like. We don't currently, typically our meetings are, as you all know, are the first Friday of the month. The first Friday of July is, of course, July 3rd. So I'm going to probably suggest that might not be the best date for our next meeting. Just going to go ahead and put that out there. Tell me if I'm wrong. So I think what we can do, we can either sort of talk about it here tonight, or staff can send out an email as we've done before with sort of a poll of, hey, here's a couple of options. Excuse me. Here's a couple of options when are folks available. I think we can anticipate probably doing Zoom meetings through the month of July at least, and maybe into August. I as you all know, every day is a new answer.
Right.
But I feel pretty safe to say our next meeting is going to be on Zoom at least. And understanding that the ordinance committee is looking at an August 20 meeting. If we meet sometime mid-early July, no reason we couldn't meet, maybe 2 times before ordinance committee gets together. That's, I guess, what I have so far. I see Robin's got some thoughts to.
Yeah, my thought is that maybe our individual comments to staff are due by July 3rd, so that you guys can start working on, like you said, what's the outlier, and give us some information so that we can sort of so that we can get some information back on what everybody else sort of is thinking, and we can start to marinate on that before we were to meet on, say, July 17th.
Yep. Sounds good by me.
And does that?
I think that's reasonable.
Does that July 17th seem like a good type of week to look for dates? Again, we can either commit to one now, or we can do an email poll if people want a little more time to.
Works for me.
Okay, I'll send something around that time frame, a couple of dates and times, and we'll see what we can get for majority.
Yeah, I think it's just my opinion out there. I think we've been a lot more effective when we're in a room and in a conversational format, as opposed to this Zoom. It's unfortunate. I think we do better when we can make a lot more ground when we're having a real discussion as opposed to trying to go through individual comments. It's not quite as productive. And I know by email, that's going to be even more challenging, but I guess that's the world we have to face. So my 2 cents there, we'll do, I think we'll do what we can as a team to put this together and march forward.
Dave, I do want to mention, I just noticed the final attendee, Rocky Risbera, has raised his hand.
Okay.
So if you're so inclined, I will invite him to participate. So Rocky, hold on a moment. I'm going to pop you over here. You're currently muted. I'm going to actually hit unmute on my end, I think. There you go.
Am I there?
You are there. I can hear you.
Yep.
Camera on? Look at that. Thank you. I appreciate the chance to weigh in. One thought that comes to mind about the growth management ordinance, in the work that this committee is going to do, I would like you to consider the fact that it's unnecessary. I really would like you to look at some of the data. I think if you look at how many units have been built in the time frame that there has been a growth management ordinance in place in this town, you'll find that it averages less than 135 units per year. And I think the whole growth management ordinance, when it was put in place, the need, people thought there was a need, and we understood that. We negotiated with the current town council, cut what we thought was the best bad deal we could at the time. And it was supposed to be a 3 to 4 year stopgap measure. It's been, I don't know, I've lost track, near 20 years now that this has been in place. We tried to explain to the council back then that the market would take care of itself, and that there would be years where we built a lot of dwelling units, and there would be years where we didn't build very many. And I think if you look back at what's happened over the last 20 years, you'll find that that's exactly what happened. There was a growth management ordinance put in place that really didn't accomplish anything other than add a couple of staff people to the town to administer it, added cost to anybody that wanted to build a home or a dwelling unit here in town. But overall, it really hasn't accomplished anything. And I would think that that has to be part of the equation, that we think about that and try to come to some conclusion. So I would appreciate if you would at least consider those thoughts. My only other thought is seeing Rick on camera. I see that he and I are seeing the same barber. So
Saving money on razor blades.
I've been told to get it cleaned up. So
As have I.
I was going to ask if this is the new COVID style, Rocky, for you.
Exactly.
And it's like, what?
I actually have a practical problem with this. I was diagnosed with sleep apnea about 1.5 years ago. So I use a CPAP machine at night, which is great. It's the best thing I ever got. But now with the beard, I get all this leakage around the face mask. It isn't working as well. So
Someone put him on mute.
I'm probably going to have to cut it off too. Oh, well.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Rocky.
Speaking of haircuts, I have a haircut at 10, so I have to leave at 9:45.
You can't miss that for sure. Rarity.
Is there any ground we need to cover here?
So we do typically end around 9:30, so we're just about at that anointed time. I think if I feel like I have some pretty good direction. Karen nodding her head. I think Karen, Jamel, and I will get together, think about what we can do to move things along. We'll get an email out here shortly, looking at a meeting the week of July 17th, see what we can pull together. Do we want to stay focused on a morning meeting? Does that seem to work best for folks? It's what we've done for years. So, okay, seeing lots of yeses. And we will, and then I guess heard, and it sounded like there was agreement by the chair to think about trying to get staff your responses to the email within the next 2 weeks by the holiday.
This
think that would be
year.
helpful.
Yeah, I'll take care of it. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I've got to learn how to do this stuff.
So,
Thanks, Jay.
yep. So, yeah, I think staff feels
So-
pretty good about where we're at.
So July 17th at 8 o'clock,
That work for everybody?
likely a Zoom meeting.
Yep.
Okay, great
Yep,
for me.
I'll send an email around.
Yep, Alan?
I think that was a thumbs up on the date.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I want to thank everybody. I'm sorry to be throwing out homework over the summer, but you know, that's what happens sometimes. But I appreciate your input. I feel confident that we can be reviewing this and make some decisions.
Yeah, well, I think it also, it will help us in us getting the comprehensive plan tied tighter together with the growth management ordinance, and it will get us all re-engaged, I think, over the next couple of weeks as we think, you know, it is unfortunate in the summertime, but COVID pushed us back here. So getting re-engaged with it, getting ourselves back up to speed, and you know, with that August deadline of the growth management ordinance, I think we should be in, hopefully we'll be in good shape by then to provide them with recommendations and some solid feedback. Anybody want to make a motion?
Motion to adjourn.
Second. All in
That felt
favor?
good.
Do we need a
We
roll
have to
call
do
for
a
this
roll
one?
call.
Yeah, you have to
If
do
you
roll
guys just
calls
start
for
logging off, there's nothing I can do. But,
Thanks
you,
for all the
Jay.
good work, staff.
Great,
With
yeah,
our
great
cursors.
And
presentation.
counselors, good job. It is
Thank
not
you.
unnecessary. The work that you're doing
Thanks.
is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yep.
But
Bye, everyone.
See you
Enjoy your
later.
All
summer.
right,
Bye.
have a nice weekend.
oh, wait, I need to stop recording. Stop.